Good evening, everybody. Thank you for those of us letting us know if you are not hearing any sound. The program is not commenced yet, so don't worry, you're not missing anything. But it seems like we have a lot of our participants here with us this evening. So I think we will go ahead and get this virtual program started, and we will have people coming in to the program throughout the evening. Yay, Deborah, I'm so glad we have sound. Yay. Thank you all. Thank you all for letting us know, because Zoom is wacky and you just never know what's going to go on. But without further ado, my name is Chloe Green. I am the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Thank you all for joining us for this evening virtual book talk presented by our Maritime Committee. And on behalf of the programming team, I first want to say thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you to our program partners for being flexible while we moved this program to a virtual space instead of a in-person event. We're so glad that we could have so many more people joining us this evening. But I would also like to shout out this evening's program partner, the Jewish Museum of Maryland, which I believe some of their wonderful staff are on with us this evening. They were so great in supporting and organizing in this event, as well as promoting it and bringing in our live captioner, Ann Armstrong. So thank you so much to Ann for joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the evening. You've seen his name in the program title, but we are happy to be joined by Steven Ujifusa. So I'm going to read Steven's bio, and then I'm going to let him take it away. But Steven is a corporate historian who chronicles the confluence of American business, social, and maritime history. A native of New York City and raised in Chappaqua, New York, Steven received his undergraduate degree in history from Harvard University and a joint master's in historic preservation and real estate development from the University of Pennsylvania. Steven is also an amateur singer and longtime member of the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia. And I personally hope Steven talks a little bit more about that. But an accomplished author, Steven is the recipient of the Washington Irving Medal for Literary Excellence from St. Nicholas Society of the City of New York, a MacDowell Artist Residency, and forgive me, I'm just gonna pass over that. But there's another literary award for nonfiction. My apologies for not being able to pronounce that. He has appeared on the National Public Radio, CBS Sunday Morning, and numerous other media outlets. And Steven resides in Philadelphia with his wife, Alexandra, and his two sons. And Steven has so many more other accomplishments and contributions, but I don't want to take any more time away from his wonderful presentation. So I'm going to give him a warm welcome. Steven, thank you for being here. And I'm going to pass this program to you. And please enjoy Steven's research.
Chloe, thank you so much for the kind introduction and all of your hard work in making this possible. Also, thank you to the Jewish Museum of Maryland. And my family has a lot of ties to Baltimore and Maryland in general. My my maternal uncle, Jeffrey Brooks, was a professor of history at Johns Hopkins for many, many years. And my cousins attended Baltimore Friends School. And in addition to that, my brother and sister-in-law live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and they are avid bird watchers, and one of their favorite places in the world is the Eastern Shore. So thank you to the great state of Maryland for your connections with our family, or my family. And also a special thanks to Fred Leiner, who has been a wonderful supporter, has brought me to speak on all three of my books to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. So thank you. For me, this book was a coming home story for me as an historian. This is my third book, and this book deals with a unanswered question that the descendants of Jewish immigrants often have asked their elders. What was life like in Russia? What was the story of how they came to America? Now, for those of you who are fans of the director Barry Levinson, one of the great native sons of Baltimore, the movie Avalon, which is set in the late 40s and early 50s, examines a Jewish family's struggle with assimilation and identity as they rise from the working class row houses of Baltimore into the upper middle class of the suburbs, and what they gain, what they lose with these connections with the old world and assimilating into general American culture. And the questions that the grandson asks his grandfather, this deep connection he has with his grandfather. And the story that is always told at Thanksgiving in Avalon is Grandpa, tell us about you came to America. And he said, I came to America in 1914. It was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. And many Jewish families did not talk about this journey from Eastern Europe, namely Russia, to the United States. 2.5 million Jews fled Eastern Europe between 1881 and 1914. And this was part of the greatest human migration in human history, where during that same period, a total of about 18 million people from Europe left for America. And today, well over 100 million people can count their ancestry or trace their ancestry back to Ellis Island alone. That doesn't count ports of entries in Philadelphia and Baltimore and in Boston and other East Coast cities. But this is a story that we often think of as people, the immigrants arrive at the Statue of Liberty and they wave and they scream and it's all happy, happy, and then they go on to have nice lives. Well, that is not the case. For these first generation immigrants, it was a 5,000-mile journey over land and sea that involved illegal border crossings, journeys in sealed trains to get to the great port cities of Hamburg, Bremen, Antwerp, Liverpool, and Southampton, and Cherbourg, France. And above all, meant leaving everything they knew behind, people, places, but also there was a very good reason for these Jews to leave the Russian Empire, because they were fleeing they were basically fleeing life-threatening situations where the Russian government was enforcing a policy of state-sanctioned anti-Semitism that involved persecution, murder, looting, and military conscription. And this family is shown here is a typical Jewish family that is halfway there. They have arrived from the Russian Empire, and they're now waiting in the great port city of Hamburg, Germany, at the immigrant village, which could handle about 5,000 immigrants at a time. And it was run by the Hamburg America line, which was the biggest carrier of immigrants to the New World during this time. And they are already shaken. They're already traumatized. They'd endured a train journey that lasted for days. They had said goodbye to everyone they knew, and now they're ready to board their ship. And the descendants of these 2.5 million Jews have contributed so much to American history and culture. It was Jews who basically gave us modern Hollywood in the 1910s and 1920s, produced actresses such as Lauren Bacall, who was the daughter of Jewish immigrants. My apologies about that. My internet was having some problems, so let me restart again. These you had musicians who also, like Irving Berlin and George Gershwin. It was Irving Berlin who wrote the second national anthem to America, the second American national anthem, and which we now know as "God Bless America." And George Gershwin, who gave us the modern American musical, and where we'd be without Jewish humor, without the Marx Brothers. It in many ways is become America's humor. And then, of course, the daughter of immigrants such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg. My own family story, we did not produce any Gershwins, but my family story was fairly typical. My great-grandparents arrived in the United States in 1895. My great-grandfather settled in Brooklyn. He became a very successful butter and egg merchant. And by the time my grandmother was born in 1916, he'd become quite prosperous. And My grandmother grew up in an atmosphere of great comfort, and she was able to go to college, which was something that was unthinkable for uh, her parents. And here she is shown at NYU in 1937, along pictured next to my grandfather, who edited the yearbook. He also was the son of Jewish immigrants. His father ran the Jewish Day newspaper. And great grandpa Isaac's obituary appeared in the New York Times when he passed away in 1942. But my grandparents, especially my grandmother, she said talking about Russia was not exactly a topic that was allowed. And growing up, she remembers that her uh, father would always make a big ritual of displaying the American flag on the 4th of July. And this was something that basically proclaimed we are Americans now. And like a lot in general, descendants of immigrants, American was an important thing for them. And the question was, what were they fleeing from? But what they were fleeing from was the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire in the 1880s and 1890s was going through a tremendous amount of political and social upheaval. And the Tsar of Russia during this period was Tsar Alexander III, whose father, the last Tsar, Alexander the Second, was assassinated by an anarchist bomber in 1881. And Alexander III reacted by blaming the Jews for this. Russia had 4 million Jews at the time, almost all of whom were confined to the so-called Russian Pale of Settlement, which today is made up by modern-day Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova. And his reaction to his father's assassination was that it's the Jews who are the big destabilizing element in the Russian Empire. They do not recognize Christ. He openly called them Christ killers. And his closest advisor, Konstantin Papadonostsev, declared that the ideal solution for Russia's Jews is that 1/3 die, 1/3 emigrate, and 1/3 disappear. And starting in the 1880s, Tsar Alexander III began a pretty intense campaign of state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, which was in great contrast to other European nations, most notably the newly unified Germany, France, and Great Britain, and Austria-Hungary, which gave Jews full citizenship rights. So while Jews were prospering and rising to higher levels in society in other parts of Europe, Jews in Russia were being relegated to second and even third-class citizens. And it was Cossacks, which was the Tsar's personal cavalry, frequently raided and burned Jewish towns as a part of a reign of terror. Ordinary Russian citizens were encouraged to beat up and kill Jews, especially on Easter. And then as part of forced assimilation, the Tsar's army conscripted Jewish kids as young as 9 or 10 years old and drafted them into the army for as long as 25 years. If they came back at all, they would not know their faith, they'd not know their family, and that was the goal. Tsar Alexander III did this to many minorities in the Russian Empire, most notably Georgians, Armenians, who had their own genocide, and also the Muslim Uzbeks and others in Central Asia. So these Jews, most of whom were very poor, had a tough, difficult decision. Some of them had become prosperous in cities like Odessa, which was relatively liberal, or in Polish cities which were largely excluded from the draconian May laws that were passed by the Tsar government in the 1880s that basically restricted Jewish business enterprises. They kind of foreshadowed the Nuremberg laws of what Adolf Hitler did in the 1930s. But ultimately, a lot of them decided they had to leave this country. The problem was that Russia did not have many deep water ports, only St. Petersburg and Odessa, and no transatlantic liners really left from these ports. The big transatlantic lines ran out of Germany and England and Belgium. So the question was, how do these immigrant Jews who are trying to get out find their way out, and how do they get to the sea? Well, enter the main character of my book, Albert Ballin, who turned a small shipping company in Hamburg into the largest shipping company in the entire world. He was born to a lower middle class Jewish family in 1857. His father dies, leaving him impoverished at age 17. Albert Ballin goes to work as an immigrant ticketing agent. He takes over his father's business. In the 1880s, he is hired by the Hamburg America line as the head of their passenger division. And he pioneers something known as indirect migration, where immigrants, Jews and Germans and Poles who are trying to sail to America, he puts them on smaller ships that sail from Hamburg to Liverpool, and then from there on, they get on bigger ships that go across the Atlantic. But by the 1890s, Albert Ballin is sponsoring the construction of larger ships that are able to make the crossing directly from Hamburg to New York City. And by 1899, Albert Ballin is appointed as the general director of the Hamburg America line, which basically is the equivalent of CEO. So a remarkable rise for someone with such humble beginnings in German society. Albert Ballin ends up having a strange relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm II very much admires Albert Ballin's program of building bigger and larger ships. They make Germany look good. Albert Ballin is given the distinction of being able to be presented at court. But Albert Ballin, for the rest of his life, always felt that when he was dealing with the Kaiser and his inner circle, he was dealing with people who could barely keep their anti-Semitism to themselves. The Empress, Kaiser Wilhelm II's wife, particularly loathed Albert Ballin. Albert Ballin was someone who didn't just build ships for the immigrant trade. He also pioneered the modern cruise, the modern pleasure cruise. Before the 1890s, sailing on ships was simply seen as an inconvenience, a way to get from point A to point B. By the early 1900s, Albert Ballin was building small ships that sailed to Scandinavia and to the Caribbean, specifically for pleasure. He also pioneers an early example of branding, where starting in 1905, he begins a relationship with the Ritz-Carlton Company of London and Paris, in which the Ritz-Carlton Company caters specialty restaurants on board, in first class, of course, on his ship. So it's an exclusive arrangement. And Ballin also has a very close relationship with the German Jewish banker Max Warburg, who runs the investment house of M.M. Warburg and Company in Hamburg. The two of them become very, very close. They have daily phone calls. And Albert Ballin had a pretty strained relationship with a lot of his family. He marries a Gentile woman in 1885 named Mariana, and he and Mariana Ballin adopt a daughter who they named Irmgard. They raise her as a Lutheran, but Albert Ballin himself never converts to Christianity. He says, "I cannot dishonor the memory of my dead father." The genius stroke that was also very controversial that Albert Ballin took to control the immigrant trade was that in the 1890s, he and a consortium of other steamship lines basically offered to take over all border control stations between the German Empire and the Russian Empire. You had a migrant crisis in which you had thousands of people trying to get out of Russia, mostly Jews, but some Gentiles as well, who were trying to escape poverty and the conscription of the Tsar's army. And there was chaos at the border. Something that actually has parallels to today. We have these migrant camps of refugees camped out on the Russian side. They pay often smugglers to carry them across the border, and then they have to find their way to the train stations to take them to Hamburg. Albert Ballin offers to take over, to basically privatize these border control stations, and creates a seamless connection of rail lines and steamships to the New World. He also builds the aforementioned immigrant village in Hamburg, which can house up to 5,000 immigrants at a time. And the immigrant village, part of which still exists today, had a kosher kitchen, it had a church, a synagogue, dormitories, and was walled off from the city of Hamburg because the city fathers associated immigrants with disease, especially cholera. This association with immigrants and disease continues to this day. But Albert Ballin turned it into a business, a very lucrative one. He was loathed by the German far right, which was extraordinarily anti-Semitic. One member of the Reichstag, who also happened to be the court preacher to the Hohenzollern royal family, declared that it was terrifying that these strangers from Palestine were getting to the closest reaches of the throne. He was also loathed by the German far left, especially the Social Democrats and the Maritime Workers Union, who saw him as a capitalist exploiter. And even members of the Jewish community in Germany really were disturbed by how Albert Ballin turned this migration business into a profitable one. Albert Ballin eventually made his peace with German Jewish aid organizations by allowing them to be stationed at the border control stations to offer aid and medical care, and also offer financial subsidies to immigrants who could not afford steamship tickets. Well, what were conditions like in third class and steerage on Hamburg America Line ships and other transatlantic liners at the time? Well, as one migrant said, who traveled to America as a child, she said, from the portholes, you could see a lot of water, but you couldn't see the sky. There was very little privacy. Bunks were stacked 2 or 3 high in the very bottom of the ship. In older ships, people ate and slept in the same space. Albert Ballin, by 1905, introduced some more luxuries to third class, including separate cabins for families, separate dining rooms with stewards who served food. He also introduced kosher food on board his ships. The rabbi of Hamburg inspected the kitchens for kosher preparation before each voyage, but it was still a very unpleasant experience. And many of these people had never, in addition to never having gone to sea before, they had never seen electric lights, they'd never seen toilets before. And this voyage lasted between 5 to 14 days, depending on the age and speed of the ship. Contrast these quarters with the luxurious first-class lounge of the SS Imperator, which was Hamburg's America Line's flagship in 1913. It was designed by the same architect that did the Ritz in London. So you get a sense of the great disparity on these ships. The class tensions on board were palpable. You had barriers separating first, second, and third class. The argument that third class needed to be kept apart from everyone was what they said was the transmission of diseases to the rest of the ship. And as one maritime historian said, on a typical German ocean liner, first class got 2/3 of the ship, but 4/5 of the people were crammed into 1/5 of the space as immigrants. They paid for these great liners. Now, who was waiting on the other side of the Atlantic to help make America the golden land, as it became known for Jewish refugees? This was the investment banker Jacob Schiff, himself an immigrant. He came from Germany, a teenager in the 1860s by Rothschilds, and he showed up in America with $500. And by the 1890s, Jacob Schiff had become the managing partner of the investment bank of Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was second only to J.P. Morgan and Company as a financier of railroads and other large concerns. Jacob Schiff had become investment banker to the Rockefellers and to the Pennsylvania Railroad and to the Union Pacific. So this made him the richest Jew in America. Jacob Schiff had a profound sense of giving back to the Jewish community. He had no rich man's hobbies. He belonged to no clubs. He owned no yachts, unlike so many other Gilded Age plutocrats. His hobby was philanthropy and Judaism. At his death in 1920, he was worth $50 million, but it is estimated that he gave away at least half of that to mostly Jewish aid societies, such as the Henry Street Settlement House on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which provided vocational training to and basically high school level classes to poor Russian immigrants who lived there. He also gave generously to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which gave out microloans to Jews who had no money but who wanted to start businesses. My wife's great-grandfather received a $50 loan from Hayes and after his arrival around 1905, and he turned that into a very successful leather business that did business both in America and in Germany. So there are countless stories of this. And Jacob Schiff was someone who often kept his donations anonymous. Whenever he showed up on the Lower East Side to visit the Henry Street Settlement House or one of his many charities, he never arrived by coach. He always arrived on foot. And these organizations made these immigrants into Americans, but there was great tension between the Russian Jews and the German Jews because most of the German Jews, like Jacob Schiff, had arrived in America before the Civil War. And by the 1890s, 1900s, it had become middle or even upper class. They were religiously Jewish, but culturally German. They spoke German at home. They had German nannies. They sent their kids to German-speaking schools, and they felt that they were basically replicating the life of the German haute bourgeoisie across the Atlantic. And by the 1890s, many of them were sending their kids to places like Harvard, although even at places like Harvard, despite their wealth, they were excluded from the final clubs and the eating clubs because they were Jewish, even if they were very wealthy. But it was here on the Lower East Side and other immigrant neighborhoods in large cities that the modern American labor movement got started with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. You had the famous strike of 1910, which was a huge walkout of all the garment workers in New York, most of whom were Jewish and Italian women. So this was the beginning of the modern labor movement. And a lot of German Jews felt very ambivalent about this because there was association with socialism and communism. But this labor movement that took place in the garment factories and other sweatshops, and Jews were heavily involved in the garment industry at the time. This created the modern labor movement and led to things such as the 8-hour day and the weekend. So we can thank these labor movements for that. The steamship agents for many lines were penetrated deep into the Russian Empire to try to sell tickets to people looking for a way out. And it was this successful business model that made Albert Ballin and the Hamburg America line extraordinarily wealthy, that got the attention of someone who was most definitely not Jewish, but definitely had an extremely strong nose for business. This was J.P. Morgan, who was Jacob Schiff's bitter rival on Wall Street. The two of them really disliked each other. They saw themselves as rivals. But J.P. Morgan wanted to do for the steamship lines what he did for railroads and steel and other big business. J.P. Morgan's specialty was taking groups of competing organizations or companies, crunching them together into basically monopolies and turning them into corporations. In 1901, he scored his biggest victory with the creation of U.S. Steel. And to create this corporation, which was basically a monopoly, he wrote a check to Andrew Carnegie for $400 million. And after that said, Mr. Carnegie, congratulations on being the richest man in the world. But he was approached around 1899 by a Philadelphia shipping magnate named Clement Griscom, who owned the White Star Line, which ran a profitable immigrant business between Antwerp and Philadelphia and Antwerp and New York. And Clement Griscom said, I have an idea. Why don't we try to put together a syndicate to buy up every single transatlantic line in operation, and especially go after the immigrant trade? And J.P. Morgan agreed. He had never failed at anything. And starting in 1901, they began buying up a number of British lines, including the famed White Star Line, for $32 million. He then tries to buy the Cunard Line. The British government gets winds of what's going on and basically blocks the sale. Cunard remains independent. Frustrated, he turns his attention to the German lines, and Albert Ballin is greatly alarmed by this. J.P. Morgan is known for buying up everything he can get his hands on, whether it's companies, railroads, or artwork. And Albert Ballin has an emergency meeting with the Kaiser, and the Kaiser basically blocks a sale of the Hamburg America line to J.P. Morgan. This was a huge blow to J.P. Morgan's ambitions because this was the most profitable steamship line in the world because of the immigrant trade. So he makes a profit-sharing agreement with Albert Ballin. Then he offers Albert Ballin a job for $1 million a year to run this new maritime trust, which he calls the International Mercantile Marine. Albert Ballin thinks for a minute and says, absolutely not. I am not leaving Germany. I'm loyal to my company, and you have fun with your company. We'll work together somehow. The International Mercantile Marine proves to be J.P. Morgan's only major failure. The company ends up losing money very quickly, and by 1909 or so, it is delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. J.P. Morgan's response to this disaster was to build ships to outdo what the Hamburg America line was doing in size, speed, and luxury. So beginning in 1909, he begins the construction for the White Star Line, which was his premier steamship line, of 3 ships that would surpass anything yet built in size and in luxury. These ships, which came online in 1911 and 1912, were the Olympic and the Titanic. A third ship, the Britannic, was launched in 1914, but never saw peacetime service because she was sunk by a mine when she was turned into a hospital ship. That's a whole nother story. But the Olympic and the Titanic, which they dazzle the world when they come online in 1911, 1912, with their luxurious first-class quarters, which take inspiration from what Albert Ballin did for his ships. But these ships can only carry around 1,000 or so in third class. The reason why is that they left Southampton, stopped in Cherbourg, France, then stopped in Ireland, and then sailed across the Atlantic. By that time, immigration from Northern Europe was pretty much dropping fast, while immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was accelerating. And the Hamburg America line had the control of that traffic. And in 1913, the Hamburg America line began launching its own series of giant superliners. There are three of them. The Imperator launched in 1913, the Vaterland, which arrived in 1914, and then launched that same year was the SS Bismarck, which was the largest ship in the world at 56,000 tons. Each of these three Hamburg America line giants were able to carry almost 3,000 people in third class and steerage. That's where the money was. But you can see by this time, Albert Ballin had become a true artist with his design of his ships. This is the Ritz-Carlton restaurant on the SS Vaterland on the upper right-hand corner. It looks like right out of a hotel. Well, April 11th marks the 112th anniversary of the Titanic departing her last port of call, Queenstown, Ireland. She had set sail from Southampton, England, the previous day, and had called at Cherbourg, France. And this is around this, it was on this day that the ship picked up her last passengers, mostly Irish immigrants, and set out to the north, into the North Atlantic for her maiden voyage, which was supposed to last about 5.5 days. She was not the fastest ship in the world. She was not able to break the speed record. She was also only half booked on this trip, which spoke volumes of the problems of the company. But was 70% full. There are probably around 50 or so Jews from the Russian Empire and Austria-Hungary on board. The ship did have a small kosher kitchen, had kosher plates and dinnerware for Jewish passengers. Second class had at least one immigrant family. Their names were Sinai and Miriam Cantor, who were from the town of Vitebsk in the Russian Empire, which was, by the way, the same town that was hometown to the artist Marc Chagall. They were both traveling. They had saved up enough money to travel second class. By traveling second class, that allowed them to skip the dreaded inspection stations at Ellis Island. There was this belief that only poor people in third class needed to go through inspections. If you were immigrating permanently to the United States in first and second class, you didn't need to go through that ordeal. They were carrying with them boxes of Russian furs to sell in America to help finance their dentistry studies. On board were also leaders of the German Jewish community, most notably Isidor and Ida Strauss. Isidor Strauss was co-owner of Macy's department store, very close friend of Jacob Schiff's, and also Benjamin Guggenheim, who was heir to the great mining fortune, traveling incidentally with his French mistress. When the ship struck the iceberg near midnight on April 14th, 1912, she was traveling at full speed into an ice field that everyone knew was there, but the captain had supposed we can see it, an iceberg in the nick of in time, and the sea was absolutely flat. There was new moon that night, and the ship could not turn fast enough. And within a matter of 10 seconds or so, there had been a series of gashes opened up into this ship. And this ship was 3 football fields long. But according to calculations, it took only 12 square feet of damage to doom this ship. 1/3 of her length was basically opened up to the sea by a series of narrow slits. For the first hour or so, there was no alarm, no panic. It wasn't until maybe about 12:30 or 12:45 that the lifeboats were swung out and uncovered. An officer approached Isidor and Ida Strauss and said, "Mr. Strauss, you're an older gentleman. You are a former congressman. I don't think would anyone mind if you're getting in a lifeboat." A lot of people didn't want to get in lifeboats. in first and second class because the ship felt safe. The ship felt totally fine. And so Isidor Straus said, no, I'm not going to go. And then his wife, Ida, of 40 years, said, no, I'm not leaving you. And then according to one eyewitness, Colonel Archibald Gracie, she turned to him and said, we've been living together for many years. Where you go, I go. So we have lived, so we shall die together. And so they pull out some deck chairs and wait for their fate. The order was on one side of the ship was interpreted as women and children first. On the other side of the ship, another officer interpreted it as women and children only. So this is why many boats left only half full. For immigrants in third class, there was no such option. They were told to stay in place. There were no lifeboats on the third class deck spaces. And by 2 o'clock in the morning, it was clear the ship was going down, the bow was awash. And as the aforementioned survivor, Colonel Archibald Gracie said, I thought I'd done my duty, loading women and children into the lifeboats. And then coming up from the first class grand staircase came a mass of humanity, several lines deep. They were steerage class passengers, women and men and children. And he said, my God, the agony of it. The ship sank after only 2.5 hours, and taking 1,500 of the 2,200 passengers and crew with her. If the ship had been fully booked with 3,500 passengers and crew, the catastrophe would have been even more horrific. And the ship only carried enough lifeboats for 1,200 people. And out of the disaster, only 705 survived. And only a few of them survived being picked up from the ICC. Most people died within 15 or 20 minutes of being in that water. Several days after the disaster, a cable ship called the McKay Bennett, which had been chartered by the White Star Line, was sent out to recover bodies. Only 300 or so corpses were recovered from the sea. They were all wearing life jackets. And among the dead recovered was Isidor Straus. His wife was never found. Another body that was found was of Sinai Cantor, who had perished. His wife had survived. And this pocket watch bearing Hebrew characters and a representation of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments was recovered from his body and sent home. People believed to be third class or crew were buried at sea, which is shocking considering the class divisions continued even after death. But this the disaster made martyrs of Isidor and Ida Straus. They became revered as a devoted Jewish husband and wife, models of a devoted Jewish husband and wife in the Jewish community in the United States, especially among poor Jews. And there were Yiddish songs written for theater and plays and all sorts of things meant to honor them. There was a big public funeral that took place for them at Carnegie Hall, of which Andrew Carnegie was the main eulogist, and thousands of poor Jews stood outside in the rain to honor them. The disaster was catastrophic for J.P. Morgan. He, by the way, was a last-minute cancellation on the Titanic, and he died a year later in Italy in disgrace. The sobering statistic was that more first-class men survived than third-class children. The chairman of the White Star Line was one of the last people to get into lifeboats, J. Bruce Ismay. He was condemned for being a coward. And this disaster was good business, unfortunately, for the Hamburg America line, which had a reputation for safety. Albert Ballin wrote a letter to his friend Max Borberg soon after the disaster, saying, I know why the Titanic sank. It's because they built that ship of too lightweight construction to save on fuel costs. And whenever I've had a ship built by the Harlan Wolff Company, I've always had to go back and told them to build these ships heavier, even if it meant spending more money on fuel. Albert Ballin's biggest fear was that war would break out between Great Britain, Germany, and Russia. And he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to prevent a European conflict. And his biggest fear was that they would interfere with the immigration trade and with the unveiling of his three mighty ships, the Imperator, Vaterland, and Bismarck, which superseded the Titanic and the Olympic as the largest ships in the world. And this picture shown on the upper left shows immigrants boarding steerage on the SS Vaterland of 1914. And you can see how Spartan conditions are on board for such a luxurious ship in her upper decks. But even then, you could see a small brass band playing, welcoming the immigrants on board. This was part of a sales tactic by Albert Ballin to make third class and steerage better than it was on other ships. And Albert Ballin's slogan for the company was "Mein Feld ist die Welt." My field is the world. But unfortunately, in the summer of 1914, Albert Ballin's biggest fears came true when Germany, Russia, France, and eventually England all declared war. And he felt that Germany was led by a bunch of people who were militarists, who were trying to basically turn what should have been a progressive, technologically advanced, cultured nation into a militaristic one. And he knew, and he wrote, that Germany could not win a two-front war between the Russian Empire and Great Britain and France. The Kaiser and his advisors dismissed people like Albert Ballin as cowards and as pacifists and as silly. And this would later feed into the deadly conspiracy theory that Jews were part of the stab in the back that prevented Germany from winning the war. The reality was it was a combination of incompetent military leadership and trying to fight a two-front war that the German Empire simply could not win, and Germany being starved into submission by the Royal Navy. During this war, hundreds of thousands of Jews in Germany and Austria-Hungary loyally served in their armies. Russia was a different story. You had mass drafts and civil unrest. You had people trying to get out, especially Jews who could not get out now. All passenger traffic had ceased. Most of Hamburg America Line's 175 ships were stuck in U.S. ports and unable to get out. And eventually, most of these ships would be seized as war prizes by America and Great Britain when America entered the war in 1917. You also had a reaction in America that had been building for a very, very long time of fear of all these people when the war ends. The Cunard or Lusitania was American opinion Germany, and Jacob Schiff made a giant mistake in 28 Americans. He can't turn his back against his native Germans as soon as he could against his own mother and father. And Russia is the great Satan of the Jewish people, willing to support a bond issue to support England and France, but I could not support the Russians in their war effort. He actually, compared to Russia, are pretty good when it came to Jewish relations. This was a huge PR problem for Jacob Schiff. And eventually, he, by 1918 or 1917, was forced to renounce his loyalty to Germany, and he joined the Allied cause as a patriotic American. But the war also accelerated greatly a movement that had started in the 1890s to greatly restrict and curtail immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It began in the 1890s with a group called the Immigration Restriction League, which was made up of a group of very wealthy, prominent men in academia, in places like Harvard and MIT, also in high society and in politics, who felt they began reading a lot of this quote unquote scientific racist literature that was coming out of Germany and France and other parts of Europe that basically declared that Europeans from Russia, Poland, Italy, the Balkans were genetically inferior to the so-called Nordic race, people from Northern Europe and the British Isles. And this was the biggest mouthpiece for this was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, who constantly pushed ethnic-based restrictions on immigrants. And then it really became popularized in magazines like Harper's Weekly. And then you also had the author Madison Grant, who published in 1915 the infamous book, The Passing of the Great Race, that argued that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, especially Jews and Italians, should be kept out at all costs from Americas, because God help us if they begin intermarrying with the native white Protestant stock. That would lead to the downfall of America. Ironically, Madison Grant never had any children and was never married, but he was very, very obsessed with other people's breeding habits, kind of peculiar. But his book was taken up even by intelligent men like Theodore Roosevelt, who, when he was president, posed himself as a friend of the immigrants, and he condemned the pogroms in Russia. But by 1915, 1916, even people like him began subscribing to this sort of stuff. And by 1917, Congress began passing the first of many restrictions against immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And by 1924, Congress passes the infamous Johnson-Reed Act, which pretty much ends all immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And it's a quota-based system that heavily favors immigrants from Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, and France, and the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian countries. It's work done. The Immigration Restriction League closes its doors. Albert Ballin dies a broken man in November of 1918. His shipping company is ruined. Almost all the ships are seized as reparations, and he says, "I just do not have the energy to rebuild this company anymore. It's just I am just so disgusted and saddened by what's happened to Germany and how it fought a war it couldn't win." And he deeply feared what would happen to Germany in the years to come, and ultimately he proved right. And these restrictions, the Johnson-Reed Act, remain in place until 1965. And during World War II, these restrictions basically condemned hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jews in Europe to death in Hitler's invasions and death camps, because they are unable to come here in spite of being in distress and having their lives ruined and having their lives in danger. So this is a legacy that we still deal with to this day. Albert Ballin's legacy was systematically erased by the Nazis in the 1930s, and his daughter and her descendants did everything they could to preserve his papers and his effects from the Nazis. They hid them in their attic in Hamburg during the 1930s and 1940s, and they miraculously survived the firebombing. Jacob Schiff dies in 1920. His funeral at Temple Emmanuel is packed, and outside are hundreds and hundreds of poor Jews from the Lower East Side who'd come up. They had walked up from the Lower East Side to the Upper East Side to pay their respects to the man that helped make America the golden land for them. In the 1960s, Albert Ballin's legacy was rediscovered and resurrected by Germany and by the city of Hamburg. And in order to tell the story of Albert Ballin, who is the lesser known of the three main characters, I was able to visit the Warburg family compound in Hamburg. The Warburgs fled Germany in 1938 after losing everything and barely surviving. In 1946, 1947, a branch of the Warburg family came back to Germany, reclaimed their mansion, reclaimed their bank, and to this day, they are very active in Jewish affairs in Germany and in the restitution of stolen property by the Nazis. I was able to visit the archives, which had a lot of undiscovered material. And then in 2021, I was able to visit Albert Ballin's great-grandson, Heinz Weber, who lives in a small village in Austria and had meticulously preserved all of his great-grandfather's papers. And thanks to him, I could not have written this book, because he gave me access to these papers. So Albert Ballin arguably brought over more immigrants to America than any other single person. And he was a person who was motivated by business first. He also was, up until World War I, a deep believer in Germany's mission, and he was sadly disillusioned by what happened. But I think he was also motivated by a sense of doing what was right, by having some sort of heart for the immigrants, giving them better conditions and enabling a seamless form of travel. Jacob Schiff was motivated almost entirely by philanthropy, and he gave away almost half of his fortune to Jewish causes. A lot of his money found his way to subsidizing steamship tickets for poor immigrants who couldn't make it. And then J.P. Morgan, who was operated almost entirely by the profit motive. But thanks to these men, we would not have these contributors to American culture and politics and business and the arts that we enjoy today. And also, we would not have Barry Levinson. So at the end of the day, this is a story of business, rivalry, and philanthropy that has reshaped America. In conclusion, I could not have written this book without the love and support of my wife, who was in addition to being a physician, was a German history major at Cornell. And in 2019, I was able to take our sons to to Hamburg, where we visited the immigration museum at Ballenstadt, which is what's left of the immigration village. And my eldest son was able to stand in the footsteps of two sets of his great grandparents, where they departed. And the sign or the wording that people see when they leave the museum is not the slogan, "My field is the world," but rather, "Das gute Leben wartet auf dich." The good life awaits you. And so I'm extremely grateful to my friends and family that have helped make this book possible. And shown here is a picture of my two sons, Isaac and Max. I should have included a picture that was taken a couple of weeks ago when we were guests of the Warburg family in Germany as a family, which was a tremendous treat, where we ate in the same house where Albert Ballin and his family were entertained many, many years ago. So thank you so much for your presentation, for having me. Apologies about the technical issues. And I'm here to answer any questions.
So we do have one question in our Q&A. It is, sorry, let me pull it up on my screen real quick. It is from, well, their name is abbreviated, but they're asking, how did immigrants afford tickets? How much did a ticket cost? And how long would a typical Russian Jew need to work to afford this? They also say, fabulous book. They thoroughly enjoyed it and learned so much about their ancestors. So they are very grateful for that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So many Jews would have to sell everything they owned to make this voyage. I mean, some Jews had some money, those that had made it into the middle class in places like Warsaw or Odessa, but most of them would have to sell everything, and they would save up for years often to make this trip. And a typical all-in for a family of four to make this journey in modern money, it would be around $10,000 when you include rail tickets, steamship tickets, the money that you had to bring with you and present at Ellis Island that ensured that you would not be a public charge. And often the model was that dad would go over first and earn some money and then eventually send money back to his family for steamship tickets. So it was not a cheap trip. So third class on the Titanic, for example, costs the equivalent of around $1,500 a person. So not a cheap trip for a large family. And this is in contrast to a second class ticket on a ship like the Titanic would maybe cost $3,500 a person. First class, you're ranging anywhere from $6,000 to $70,000, depending on the size of the cabin.
That's a lot of money. All right, thank you. I think if there are any other questions or comments for Steven, now is the time to drop them in our Q&A chat. I also do want to be conscious of time. We are a minute out from 7 o'clock. We are happy to hang around for 1 or 2 more minutes if anybody has additional questions or comments. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm looking at the books needed, the questions here in the box, and one was bribery needed? And yeah, before the border control stations were taken over, people would often have to pay smugglers to send them across the border. So that was something that was done. Very dangerous. You had also, you talk about survivor's guilt. I remember hearing someone who was interviewed who came over as a young girl in the 1920s from Poland. And she said, I think about this voyage because all my mother's family, and there were 100 people because we it was a voyage that made the difference between do something like this, and that the attempted extermination of Europe's Jews would be so scientifically done. I think it was just such a shock. My wife's grandfather had family that remained behind in Warsaw, and there are letters that survive from the Warsaw Ghetto that show these family members pleading him for money for something, and the letters were stamped with a swastika with a Wehrmacht symbol, and they were censored, which is haunting. Most of them didn't make it.
Steven, is it easier for you to read the Q&A box and kind of answer?
Yeah, I can, and just give me a signal when it's time to.
We can answer all of them. I'm really want to be conscious of your time,
Let's
but
see. Let's see. Do you see a comparison of the 20th century as opposed to Southern Europeans? Today's fear people coming from Mexico, Central America, and South America. I think there's a similarity. You have what you have as a refugee crisis on the border. That was similar. I think the difference between these two sorts of immigrations was that this mass immigration from Europe, everyone had to arrive by ship, and there was a policy between 1881 and 1914 that pretty much said you have to have a certain amount of money, you have to not have contagious disease such as trachoma or cholera, and only 2% of all immigrants were rejected from Ellis Island. So it was a relatively small number. The policy was relatively unrestricted, but at least at that time there was a policy. Today we're in a situation where the fighting is so partisan that there's no agreement on a policy. Should I answer one more question, or?
Sure, we can answer all of them. We do not have to end at 7. I want to be respectful of your time.
Sure, I should actually leave soon to come to dinner, but let me just answer one more question.
Yeah,
where did the idea come to write this book? My motivation? Well, I will say that I got this book idea in 2019. It came from a conversation my wife and I had at a pizza place in West Philadelphia, where we used to live at 43rd and Baltimore at the Clarkville restaurant. And we were talking with two professors from Swarthmore, one of whom was a German professor from Hamburg. And I mentioned Albert Ballin, and she said, "Oh, in Hamburg, we love Albert Ballin." And we were talking back and forth, and my wife said, "Maybe that should be your next book." And I thought writing this book, when I got the book deal, would be the hardest part would be writing. I didn't speak German, Yiddish, or Russian. But then we were faced with the COVID pandemic, where the world shut down. Thankfully, I was able to get a lot of materials in before the world shut down and I couldn't travel. But yeah, writing this during the Trump years and writing this during a period of such uncertainty and partisan fighting, and it was scary. And for me, I was trying to keep my hope in America alive while writing this. It was really scary. And this country has a lot of problems and a lot of dark history, but I look at it and I'm like, well, you look at Russia and their history of autocracy and serfdom and violent repression. It's like if the lights in America do go out, the world is in deep trouble. So this book was, and what would all these people who came to America giving up everything, and a lot of them sacrificed a lot. A lot of these first generation immigrants didn't make it. A lot of them died of disease or industrial accidents. The second generation felt this great debt of the sacrifice of their parents. And this is something that immigrants feel today, not just 100 or 120 years ago. So if we fail them, that would be a tremendous tragedy for the world. To not make this country a richer, stronger, better place.
Thank you, Steven. That's a very true sentiment that I think that resonates with everybody here and many, many people who have immigrant history in their lineage. So thank you so much. I don't want to keep you. I know you got a family to go take care of, but I just want to say thank you so much, Steven, for this amazing presentation and your research and your insights. I think everybody in this presentation learned so much from you. Thank you to everybody who logged in and got to hear from Steven and joined us on this wonderful program and stuck with us during our tech issues. These things happen on Zoom. But this program will be recorded and posted on our virtual program archive in coming weeks, and that has been sent out in a follow-up email for you all. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining. We hope you enjoyed. Thank you again, Steven. I don't want to keep anymore, so.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thanks for all your hard work.
Of course. All right, everybody have a good night. Take care.
Good night.